So, couple of quick things. First, this video covers adult themes including violence, military engagements, PTSD, and some pretty gory stuff. It is a Resident Evil game after all. And second, Jill Valentine is one of my favorite fictional characters, so I'm not without bias, but I think there's a lot of merit in objectively looking at this topic. Also, I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV, so if any of this resonates with you, especially if it triggers intense feelings related to your own lived experience, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. And in the words of one of my favorite philosophers, be excellent to each other and keep an open mind. The Resident Evil franchise is a fascinating remix and reimagining of a now classic subgenre and its many conventions. Part haunted house, part apocalyptic survival, part body horror, part Marxist critique of late-stage capitalism. The zombie genre is filled with everything from social commentary to self-indulgent guts and gore. And by gosh, we like our gore. But the best of the genre stands head and shoulders above its peers for what its story has to say about who we are beneath the layers of artificial edifice.
Don't fuck up like I did. Go!
The mall rat malaise giving way to the immediacy of survival in the most unthinkably hostile circumstances. And from those circumstances arise characters that enter our cultural lexicon as both myth and legend for what they have to say about the human condition. For better and, just as often, for worse.
He would have turned. There's your sense of self-preservation.
In the S.D. Perry novels, Jill Valentine is something of a contradiction, and not many concrete details are given, and I like that. It allows the reader to fill in the blanks with their own creativity. But some things are certain in the now non-canon novelizations. Jill was born into chaos. Her father was probably something like a cross between Danny Ocean and Uncharted Sully.
Whiskey and a whiskey.
A highly skilled and charismatic thief with clear paternal instincts.
Know what I love about partying with a bunch of crooks?
What's that?
Nobody cares if you smoke indoors.
Been practicing my speech a little bit. Did I rush it? Felt like I rushed. No, it was good. I liked it.
Jill's mother was largely absent, meaning that the burden of parenting was solely on his shoulders. Dick Valentine, international man of mystery.
Danger's my middle name.
But after many years, a job went south and Jill's dad was caught and sentenced to prison. And it was only then that he did what any father would and should have done from the very beginning. Do everything in his power to prevent Jill from enduring his fate. This left Jill disillusioned, at the very least, and angry. After all, this must have felt like a betrayal, and in a very real sense, it was. To have your entire worldview upended almost overnight is enough to give even the most resilient among us whiplash. Suddenly, everything we thought we knew is called into question, and what we choose to do next is anyone's guess. We're certainly in no position to make wise choices. And the anger turns inward, churns and froths and swirls in the cragged striations melting away at our most cemented foundations. And like a volcano, it must eventually find its release.
Oh, yeah. Me too.
The ballroom. I'll meet you there. Someone call for a limo.
So Jill, being of sufficient age to make her own contractual decisions, makes what appears on the surface to be a baffling choice. Baffling, if somewhat understandable. After spending her formative years becoming self-reliant, outrunning the law, escaping the consequences of her actions, and generally living her best independent life, she inexplicably decides to join the military. A place where escaping the consequences of one's actions is explicitly frowned upon, if not entirely unheard of. And yet it makes sense. Where else would she go if her goal was to completely deconstruct both who and what she was? Inexplicable, but understandable. And certainly the military seems like a great fit for someone with her very particular set of skills.
Skills I've acquired over a very long career. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
But these are not the choices of an altruistic, benevolent person. Remember, she's angry and very likely has no shortage of daddy issues. She wants to see some action and fuck some shit up. And the front lines are starting to look very appealing. In a remarkable display of perseverance and general badassery, Jill decides to excel in the armed forces. Remember, this is the late 80s and early 90s, a time when Sly Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger were inseparable icons of military marketing.
What do you say, John? Fuck him.
If it's a mission no man can survive, he's the man for the job. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Commando.
Let's party.
When women in the military made up less than 10% of active duty and reserves, when there were absolutely no women in special forces, no female Navy SEALs, no girls growing up to become Army Rangers. And yet, the feminist call for change pervaded even into these traditionally male-dominated arenas.
You're not taking away my weapon.
Yes, I am.
And at the forefront of this conversation was, unsurprisingly, Hollywood, depicting the numerous and varied trials and struggles to which far too many would turn a hypocritically blind eye.
The great question is, how can we win America's peace? I pledge to you tonight that I shall meet this responsibility with all of the strength and wisdom I can command. In accordance with your hopes, mindful of your concerns, sustained by your prayers.
And these are the rallying cries of the hawkish that so conveniently ignored the deaths of so many thousands of women and children at the hands of young men.
Shit, you see that fucking head come apart, man?
Many in their late teens and early 20s. Some too young to drink alcohol, but old enough to take a life and spend the rest of theirs wrestling with the consequences. Vietnam having been so thoroughly televised, so thoroughly rung through the Washington spin machine, and so impossible to ignore.
This seems to be the last chapter in the history of American involvement in Vietnam. It's also been the largest single movement of people in the history of America itself.
And films like Zero Dark 30, G.I. Jane, Courage Under Fire stood in a long line of cinematic criticisms of just this masculine phenomena.
In the end, everybody breaks, bro. It's biology.
Featuring representations of what strength and resilience look like through a uniquely female lens, whilst simultaneously celebrating the indomitable female spirit.
Bin Laden is there. And you're gonna kill him for me.
And don't forget, Demi Moore was a fucking badass.
Don't you tell him shit!
And Jessica Chastain showed us exactly the tenacity and endurance it takes to achieve mission accomplished.
You must be pretty important! You got the whole plane to yourself! Where do you want to go?
And Hollywood learned its lessons from the immensely influential Pam Grier, Sigourney Weaver, Linda Hamilton, Angela Bassett, Melanie Griffith, Sharon Stone, Carrie Fisher, Jodie Foster, Holly Hunter, Whoopi Goldberg, Alfre Woodard, Frances McDormand, Gina Davis, Susan Sarandon, Cicely Tyson, Nichelle Nichols, Audrey Hepburn, Dolly Parton. This list goes on for a very long time. Is it any wonder so much of Jill Valentine is influenced by such incredible cinematic representations of strength and character? And that's not to say these were strong women beating men at their own game. That's entirely missing the point. These were women first, whose strength, be it physical, mental, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, so thoroughly outclassed their opposition as to blaze a new trail toward an empowering horizon. The point is, the tide in the United States had so obviously turned. Everything from our passing conversations to the media we consumed was laced with the same sense of urgency. Women were far more capable than men gave them credit, and yet, in the institutions where it mattered the most, those places where brute strength and blind obedience were the norm, things remained entirely unchanged.
But most of all, what I resent is your perfume, however subtle it may be, competing with the aroma of my fine $3.59 cigar, which I will put out this instant. If the phallic nature of it happens to offend your goddamn fragile sensibilities, does it?
No, sir.
No, sir. What?
The shape doesn't bother me, sir. Just the goddamn sweet stench.
Then along came Jill. Someone so capable, so mind-bendingly badass that she becomes the first female soldier in U.S. history to be recruited into Delta Force, which, as you may recall, is more than just a series of Chuck Norris flicks from the 80s.
It's a new age of terror that requires a new breed of warrior. The Delta Force.
Delta Force is a Tier 1 counter-terrorism unit designed to kill or capture high-value targets, dismantle terrorist cells, engage in direct action missions and hostage recovery, covert missions working directly with the CIA, close protection missions guarding VIPs, and engaging in unconventional warfare.
Delta Force is funded out of secret government accounts, away from the public eye, and is believed to answer only to the president. But others claim that its purpose maintaining the United States' role as a leading power and as the world's police force necessitates the lack of restrictions and accountability surrounding its activities. The Delta Force is one of 2 military outfits in the United States charged with counter-terrorist operations. Like the other, the Navy's Special Warfare Development Group, Delta Force can deploy at a moment's notice. But unlike Dev Group, Delta Force doesn't officially exist.
In short, Jill was a fucking badass. Full stop. And details of her service are either redacted or were never officially sanctioned. We can only guess as to what she was directly engaged and to what ends. But we can't infer much from her decisions up to this point. After all, one does not simply train in Delta Force. One is rigorously selected to become a mighty hammer. And to a hammer, everything is a potential nail.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa, and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. These countries had hoped the use of force could be avoided. Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave. I've told the American people before that this will not be another Vietnam. And I repeat this here tonight. Our troops will have the best possible support in the entire world, and they will not be asked to fight with one hand tied behind their back. We have no argument with the people of Iraq. Indeed, for the innocents caught in this conflict, I pray for their safety.
So by the time Jill was recruited into STARS in 1996, she had already amassed her share of skeletons and trapped them deep within her own hurt locker. The memories of her former lives tucked neatly away into the compartments of her mind palace, the anger festering into a deep rot, poisoning her ability to trust others, and the dreams of her younger self buried deep beneath the sea of one-liners and cheap whiskey. The layers of snark only masking what is so painfully obvious to the rest of us, with our own bag of hurt to contend with. The VA's National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder website details the following. PTSD is a mental health problem that some people develop after experiencing or witnessing life-threatening events like combat, a training accident, or sexual assault. After this type of event, it's normal to have upsetting memories, feel on edge, or have trouble sleeping. Most people start to feel better after a few weeks or months. And if it's been longer than a few months, and the thoughts and feelings from the event are still upsetting you and causing you problems in your life, you may have PTSD. Symptoms include avoidance, traumatic anniversaries, triggers, sleep deprivation, reliving the past, feeling numb, hypervigilance, and interestingly, and often overlooked, thrill-seeking, or, as I prefer to call it, chasing nightmares. Now, according to ResidentEvil.com, Jill is an elite police officer who's escaped countless terrors, a master of stationary weapons and dodging. She's one tough cookie. And this write-up was within the last few years. Not exactly progressive, and not accurate. Jill may have all the markings of a tough cookie, of someone who's so-called highly functional, but she also has all the markings of someone with severe PTSD and no way to control it, let alone do the ongoing work necessary to alleviate her symptoms. From the opening moments of Remake, we see a brief window into the depths of Jill's despair, an apartment in utter disarray, and not from the imminent move, rather, a direct reflection of her inner chaos. Every empty beer bottle tossed unceremoniously to the floor, every half-eaten fast food delivery, every hastily written and crumpled note, every pharmacological ingredient poured out and not taken, every correlation plastered onto a hastily assembled billboard, every faucet left running for what may be hours on end. Jill's very environment, now a transliteration of the unaddressed trauma seeping through her tough cookie exterior. And not simply from the Arclay Mansion incident. Instead, this is the compounding result of every shot fired, every terror cell dismantled, every item stolen, every phone call from her father ignored. In a personal note to parties unknown, Jill finally opens up, discarding the formalities, confessing her inability to sleep soundly, if at all, and going as far as to compare herself to the very things she fought and escaped only weeks prior. I'm barely eating. Barely sleeping. I'm going crazy. I feel like the living dead. More than an admission of failure, this becomes a cry for help to someone we can only assume is close enough to have become her adopted family. Chris, maybe? Or Barry? Brad, even? In the same note, she advises them to pick up the investigation where she left off in the event of her death or disappearance. After all, she knows exactly how to make people disappear, even if she can't tell anyone how she gained such knowledge. In 1996, Jill, having left the military for whatever reason, gets personally recruited by Wesker. According to the Resident Evil wiki, her job was to be the team's B&E specialist, notably not a detective, not an investigator, not an interrogator, not an infiltrator. Her job was to help the STARS team in matters of breaking and entering. And leaving aside the fact that police can't even consider breaking and entering without probable cause and or a warrant, one has to ask, what the hell was going on in Raccoon City that they needed a STARS team to begin with? But remember, this was the early 1990s, an era when crime in the United States was skyrocketing, when the satanic panic was in its final death throes in the prevailing conversations, and when the war on drugs propelled conservative calls for law and order to a fever pitch. Right about the time when Jill would have first accepted her role at RCPD.
New and intense scrutiny on the activities of satanic cults.
Stories of devil worship and satanic cults corrupting young minds.
Tonight, I want to talk to you about violence in our cities and justice for our citizens.
Young black males in my district are feeling at this moment, if they could not get a conviction with the Rodney King video available to the jurors, that there can be no justice in America.
There are fires burning, there are people being beaten, there is looting. It is a dangerous night in the city of Los Angeles.
I think there's been too little effort to bring people together across racial lines. This is a human problem. People in this country don't trust each other and don't trust the system.
During this entire incident, we've heard constant references to respect for law and order. And more particularly, what they mean is respect for law enforcement.
It's been the brutality of a mob, pure and simple.
Our diversity will either be our undoing or the source of our greatest strength.
A crisis in our country, says the McCone Commission, so serious and explosive is the situation that unless it is checked, the August riots may be only a curtain raiser to what could blow up one day in the future. What shall it avail our nation if we can place a man on the moon but cannot cure the sickness in our city?
Bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil.
The victims of the Oklahoma City bombing have been given not vengeance, but justice. And one young man met the fate he chose for himself. For the survivors of the crime and for the families of the dead, the pain goes on. Final punishment of the guilty cannot alone bring peace to the innocent.
The fact that Jill would specifically choose a job that required her to utilize her history as a thief and someone with bomb disposal training is fascinating. For someone trying to escape her past, she continues to make choices that force her to confront it, and yet her catharsis is always one step out of reach. Sound familiar? Cut to July 23rd, 1998. We all know the story. Arclay Mansion incident. 6 survivors, depending on how you played. Jill, Chris, Barry, Brad, Rebecca, and yes, even Wesker, all flee the final explosion. And everyone except for Brad is exposed to the T-virus in one form or another. Indeed, they're all bitten by zombies many times. Again, depending on how you played. And don't forget, infected birds, and dogs, and hunters, and killer bees, and giant spiders, giant snakes, giant sharks, gigantic freaking killer plants, and generally speaking, by a ton of things that creep through the worst parts of one's imagination, as well as the tragic victims of their own childhood trauma and illegal genetic experimentation, having had their parents cruelly ripped away from them in a whirlwind of death and decay. That also sounds familiar. And tensions are high. Are they now all infected? Will they succumb to the same virus that killed the Arclay Lab researchers, reanimating their lifeless corpses into the living dead? Robbing them of their humanity and spreading like a plague throughout their once beloved city streets? A very real concern, and one that grips Jill as she must now wrestle with her own mortality, reliving the same moments again and again and again and again, consistently berated and dismissed by her superiors, terrified of a threat she can neither identify nor destroy, beleaguered by that lingering sweat at the nape of her neck, causing her hair to stand on end, fearing an invisible assailant invading her body, transforming her from the inside out. And it's at this precise moment of existential dread that the story of RE3 Remake begins. September 28, 1998, 2 months after the Arclay Mansion incident. The sounds of sirens blare in the distance, followed by the hushed cries and small explosions. A distant chorus of low groans rides the wind, invades the nearby intersections, and spills into the newly abandoned and ransacked storefronts.
Citywide emergency has been declared.
The CDC has quarantined the lower Midwestern region of the U.S.
Emergency responders are now scattered and disorganized, either lost amongst the carnage and ruined building exteriors, or already succumbed to the maddening waves of undead.
Fucking hell.
Jill awakes in a panic. The nightmare seared into her hippocampus.
Gets worse every night.
The only illumination coming from the neon glow blaring across the street and spilling through her window blinds like prison bars clashing with the suffocating shadows. Her television flashes to life in a fritz, looping emergency broadcasts one after another. And that sound, the all too familiar sound of rushing water in the near distance, an invitation to relive a moment from her imagination that she confronts on a nightly basis. And then, the phone rings. A terse and impassioned call to action, and immediately after, a first of what would likely be 1,000,001 jump scares telling you that the storytellers aren't messing around.
Hello?
Jill, are you okay?
Brad, is that you?
Listen, you gotta get out of there.
What are you talking about?
I don't have time to explain. You gotta get out of there right now.
All right, let me grab my...
This is an action game after all. And whatever horrors await us in the looming dark, they will not respond to our in-depth investigations and incisive inquiries. No. Our job is to fuck some shit up. Fortunately, we are a hammer. And Nemesis is our nail.
What the hell is that thing?
And if we can suspend the disbelief just long enough to ignore the obvious clash between grounded narrative and bombastic dialed to 11 action sequences, there's an immensely enjoyable experience to be had.
How is this fucker not dead yet?
Just know they're gone. Come, this way.
Nikolai, what are you doing?
It's not after you.
Nikolai!
Get off my train, shitbird!
There's a reason that after I completed my first playthrough, I leapt from my seat shouting, "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfuckers!" Yet there's an unfortunate and glaring problem. The story the developers want to tell isn't the story they end up telling. And rather than using their game as an allegory for overcoming PTSD, building on the foundations laid in previous games and extra-canonical materials, they merely use this as an uneven springboard for an allegory of a jealous stalker ex-boyfriend that frustratingly won't take the hint.
Go! Go!
Come on, forget about him!
Come on, let's get out of here.
In part 2 of our critical look at the flawed but awesome Resident Evil 3 Remake, I'll dive headlong into the world of zombie cinema and discover deep cuts and references that inform so much of RE3 Remake's unfolding narrative. And I'll discuss how the storytellers missed the mark where PTSD is concerned, but I'll also present a case for how the raw materials are there, and which key moments had the potential to truly allow Jill Valentine to achieve the catharsis that she, and by extension, all of us, were so unfortunately denied. And in case I haven't been clear up to this point, Remake is a fantastic game, and I highly recommend you play it by whatever means are suitable to you, if only to send a message to Capcom that Raccoon City still retains an incredible amount of untapped storytelling potential.
They'll call off the strike if, and this is one big-ass if, we can deliver the vaccine to them before they launch.
How long do we have?
Hours. Maybe.
Then let's not waste one more second.
This way.